Thanks for coming, and thanks for inviting me to be here. I've been sick, so my voice is a little off, but I'll do the best I can. So we're going to talk about creating board reports that your board will love. I've got the more accurate title there in the smaller print, but it was a little too wordy, so I figured it wouldn't work well for the actual title of the presentation. But I want to get to know each other a little bit, get to know you guys, the audience, so I can tailor the presentation a little bit, and then introduce you to who I am. We're going to do a board presentation. So I'll give a presentation and you guys will all pretend to be board members and you'll provide some feedback on it. And then we'll discuss how that board presentation went after with some principles for making good board presentations. So before we get to who I am, I'm curious, how many people here work in cybersecurity? Raise your hand. So a handful. How many are senior leaders in cyber? Good, quite a few. How many regularly, or at least annually, report to the board of directors? A handful? Great. Okay, one of you guys come up here. Give us. Okay, so let me tell you about who I am. I've been in IT for over 20 years. I was trying to add it up, and I was like, past 20. I think you can just say over 20 years, and it's fine. My last decade, I've worked with the Larry H. Miller Company. And I've got my few most recent roles here, Director of IT at Megaplex, Director of Strategic Solutions, which was made up. Currently, I'm VP of Cybersecurity and Operations. And the whole point, and that's my daughter, our youngest, we have 4 kids. So you'll notice that we're Trailblazers fans. When I applied to the Jazz, they were like, you like basketball? I was like, yeah, I grew up in Oregon. I'm a big fan of Trailblazers. They're like, don't tell anyone. Just keep that to yourself. So I had to be a closet Trailblazers fan until they sold the Jazz, and now I can be a public one again. So the whole point of this slide is always to show why you should listen to me. And I want to kind of explain why I'm a good person to talk about this. When I got one of my first management positions, I was having a really hard time. There was so much getting thrown at me. I was stressed out, and I didn't know how to deal with all these crises that were constantly happening, right? And I remembered one of my first jobs, I worked at a machine shop right out of high school for a friend of mine named Bryce Brady. He was a fantastic guy, and he owned the company. And I always admired that every single catastrophe just rolled right off him. He never elevated his voice. He never got put out. Like something, a $400,000 machine would blow up, and he'd just go out and calmly say, all right, let's figure it out and get to work. And I was like, Bryce will help me know how to solve this problem. He'll help me know how to be calm and how to be a manager. So I called Bryce on the phone and I explained my situation, and I was like, I've got all this stuff coming at me. I'm stressed all the time. I can't handle this, and I really need your help. And his advice, what he told me was, and so I said, how do you do it? How do you just remain calm? And he said, I've just always been like that since I was born. So just do that. Just be calm, and you'll be fine. And that was useless. That was the worst advice. I'm really glad that he didn't try and make something up, that he was honest, so I really appreciate Bryce for that. But what I learned is you don't ask someone how to do something that they are naturally gifted at, because they can't teach you. They're good at it from the start. You ask someone who wasn't great at it and who's had to get better. So I'm one of those people that wasn't great at it at the beginning of giving board presentations, but I've given quarterly board presentations for the past 5 years or so, and I've gotten better over time. So that's why you should listen to me. It's not because I'm an amazing, natural, charismatic speaker, but because over time I've had to learn it, and because I'm still in the thick of it, I remember what I've had to learn, and I can share that with you guys. So that was the reason why I wanted to put together this presentation and why I thought it would actually be helpful. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to get into the mindset of a board member. And what's interesting is how directors, right? People on the board of directors are called directors, which is, I don't know, that makes sense, but I never thought about it before. Directors have a ton of different backgrounds. I was looking up statistics to try and figure out, what's the typical director so that we could more get into the character. But really, the only thing that are common is that they're generally older. They're average 60 years old. And they're generally educated, but the most common degree is a bachelor's degree. And generally, they have some kind of business or academic or military or government or other public success. So they've done something that people recognize was valuable, and they invited them to be on the board of directors because of that unique insight. it's usually not specifically because of their education, because they have a doctorate or something. In fact, you know what the most common, any ideas what the most common alma mater is for board members? Statistically, 10% of board members all went to the same school. Any ideas? You guys shout it out. Yale? That's what I would think, right? What else? Any other guesses? One more guess. I really need you guys to be interactive or this is going to be terrible. West Point. That's a really good guess. University of Phoenix is the most common board director school. So they're typically not because they went to a Ivy League or whatever. It is something that they did in their life, right? So the second way to get into the board member mindset is to ask, what is the board member's motivation? What is it that they're trying to accomplish in those board meetings? Okay, so to understand that, we have to take one step back and say, why do we do board meetings anyway? Why do we report at all? The reason we report is the same reason we measure stuff. In How to Measure Anything, Douglas Hubbard, fantastic, except exceedingly dry book. Douglas Hubbard says, why do we care about measurements at all? There are just three reasons. The first, and the focus of this book, is that we should care about a measurement because it informs key decisions. Measurement is about supporting decisions. So the board of directors are there receiving reports with data in order to allow them to make decisions. And what are the most common decisions that a director needs to make? What's interesting is how few they actually are. So in boards that lead, the authors outline three things. When to take charge, these are things that board members are directly in charge of. When to partner, this is things they advise off. And then when to get out of the way, which I just ignored because we don't care about that. So the stuff that directors are typically directly in charge of is when to take charge. They're on the far left. And it's not a long list. The central idea of the company, kind of having that central germ of the strategy, the selection of the CEO, how the board itself functions, ethics, and compensation. That's the majority of their power is setting a basic strategy, running themselves, and then choosing a CEO. Those are the biggest things they do. And then compensation is just how do you influence the CEO, right? How do you incentivize them correctly? So it's interesting, being a board director, being a director is kind of a difficult position because you have a lot of responsibility, and yet you really only have one great big lever you can pull on to really change things at the company, which is let's fire the CEO and hire somebody else, right? That's their biggest job. So I'm going to give a board presentation, and all of you need to get into the mindset of a board member, pretend that you're there. I originally, when I was creating this presentation originally, I had this whole slide about method acting and how to get into it. And it turns out it's way too involved and it would take like a year. You'd have to live as a board member. So we're not going to do that. Instead, you're just going to have to pretend as best you can. So remember that you're all board members. You're going to provide me feedback. You're going to ask questions as if you're in a board presentation while I give this presentation. Your background is you're older, you're educated, and you have some kind of public access. Create your own little narrative there. And your motivation is that you are making decisions to improve the health of the company. Primarily, should we keep the CEO? Should we change his pay? Or her pay? Are we operating with integrity, or are we managing risks, right? Those are the main questions that you're asking during the board presentation. So we're going to get into the mood, shake out, think about what your motivation is. This is the board meeting that they built on the 10th floor of the Larry H. Miller building in Sandy there. So you go into the thing and sit around in your big fancy chairs. I, as the person presenting the cybersecurity board report, would not be sitting in one of those chairs. I'm off on one of the alcoves on the side, just waiting for someone to say, all right, cyber's up, and I come in, and I'm all nervous and sit down and do stuff like I'm doing right now. So I'm just going to pretend that I'm giving this board, and I want you to pretend that you're board members and think about how you would react, knowing that the decision you're trying to make is, should we keep the CEO? Are we managing risk? Are we behaving ethically? And do we need to change pay structure, right? Okay. So here we go. Oh, the other thing before I get into it is that all the numbers, this is based on board presentations I've given in the past, although I kind of mashed them together. All the numbers and stuff are made up. So if you're trying to add up to like 100%, for example, it's not going to work because I just threw numbers out there. So ignore the numbers and just kind of focus on the content of the presentation. Thanks for having me here for the Q4 Cybersecurity in the Audit Committee. Today we're going to get right to it because I know we've got a lot to cover and your time is really valuable. We have risk quantification. We'll talk about the assessment results from our CSF assessment, as well as some recent cybersecurity events. Last year in Q4, we introduced risk quantification. I know it had been a request of the board for a long time to kind of detail the potential financial impact and of some various kinds of hacks. So we introduced that and how our defenses mitigated that and reduced the cost. There was some feedback that we wanted it a little bit simpler, that it was kind of overwhelming. So especially because some of the amounts were really high, like a data breach could be $60 million. And it's hard to make decisions based on that huge quantity. So we're introducing one more metric, which is called annual loss exposure. So in risk management, they use annual loss expectancy. That is, you take a really huge risk like an earthquake, and you figure out how much it's going to cost if it happens one time, and then how frequently it happens, and then you divide the cost out over the years to figure out how much you should save each year, right? So we're introducing annual loss exposure, which is basically taking all of the potential cyber breaches, all potential risks, adding them up, looking at the probability of compromise and their predicted frequency in years, and that generates one number. Just like before, last year we talked about how the potential impact and likelihood, those aren't 100% sure. There's not a right number that we're going for. What we're primarily concerned about is trajectory. We want to see, is our probability of attack going down? Is the likelihood of compromise going down? Same thing with annual loss exposure. This is just one more thing that takes all of our risk data and puts it into one number, and we just want to see, is it going down or up? That's what we care about, okay? So here is the dashboard for Contoso Imaging, that division of the organization. You can see that in 2022, our average impact for various types of attacks was about 10 million, and that's gone down this year 10%. Likewise, our average likelihood has gone down this year. So you can see overall our annual loss exposure has decreased 15%, which we feel pretty good about. We also have some cybersecurity budget numbers here. I'm not going to get into them in depth, but just know there hasn't been any major shakeups there. Below that, you can see our CSF assessment results. So when we started this in early 2021, we were at a 1.5. Remember, it's on a 4-point scale for maturity. We got all the way up to a 3.7 last year. And then this year, we dropped down a little bit. That's okay. Our target, remember, is 3.0 across the board. We hit that in all of our divisions, so we're pretty happy with it. So it went down a little bit. We have an eye on it, but we're not super concerned about it yet. Off to the right, we have key developments. Those are the things that kind of impacted these numbers that they were in your pre-reads, so you can go over them in depth if you want. I just want to call out that the likelihood reduction, the team spent a lot of time and effort improving our web application security, and that's what had the biggest impact, so they should get some kudos for that. Our current highest risk is still a data breach at 27 million per incident. We reduced that from last year because we spent a lot of time trying to reduce the amount of PII we were storing, okay? So that's how this division is going. Any questions about this slide, about the numbers that we have here?
How will it affect the stock price?
How will it affect the stock price? Only up forever. No, we do talk about that. When we talk about the recent cyber events, there is that new SEC ruling that you have to share out your information about data breaches. So we'll talk about that's the only time that cybersecurity really impacts stock price is during an event. And we'll talk about that in the next slide. That's a good question, though. What else? How do we compare the competition? That's really good. So in the appendix, we have the detailed numbers for these provided by the person that we get all the Threat Connect is our partner that provides some of these numbers for potential impact. Generally, we're lower than our industry, not by a huge amount, 10 or 20%, but we're a little bit lower. And remember, our strategy overall is not to spend all the money and have perfect. It is just to be better than everyone else, so the ROI for attacking us is lower, right? Just a little bit better. Any other questions?
It seems like we overshot our target. Are we over-resourcing security?
I feel really good about that's a good point. I feel really good about our spend right now. So last time we brought up that we felt like we were at a good place and we didn't want to spend a bunch more. We're always evaluating tools, but I feel like we're pretty well resourced. We don't want to reduce it. We don't want to increase it a ton. Any other questions?
Do you feel like these positive trends will continue to the next fiscal year?
I think our trajectory is really good. If we continue with a lot of the projects we put in place, and in the appendix, we include several different projects that will affect these numbers, I think will continue to improve. But again, we've reached that thing, kind of like when you look at our maturity, we've reached a good level. So we expect to see up and down. What we don't want to see is a big drop. If we see a little bit down or flat, it's not the end of the world. We just don't want to see that big drop, right? Yeah.
Is it worth lowering our target and taking more insurance?
Potentially, no. I would say that like our CRO has looked into our risk level with the insurance, and he's pretty happy. Actually, we proactively shared some of our reports with our provider, and they reduced our premium like 30% this year. So we're pretty happy with that.
But will those savings on that premium offset more by reducing overall cost by lowering our target? Can I drive 10 cents more derivative to our shareholder?
By further reducing, I think you could potentially, but you got to remember that sorry, this keeps running on me. That we're just trying to manage this risk at the appropriate level. So there's not a right number. There's not a like, when we look here and we say, oh, this is 15%. We're just looking at trajectory. As long as we're still steadily moving in the right direction, we don't want to make big changes. If we hit a plateau and we level off, we'll re-examine it. Yeah, one last question.
Do you feel the 5% increase in the budget was worth the risk reduction? I know that our target went down on the NIST scoring. And do you expect to see 5% increases year over year, or has that changed in the future?
So the main reason that we went up was because of the increase in endpoints. So it was more of a scale thing. If you look at our cost per endpoint, it actually went down. So we're enjoying the economies of scale. So the fact that it went 5% is just because we have more stuff to protect. Okay, that's great. So our recent cyber events, we have two that we want to discuss. Typically here we would discuss any internal events. We didn't have any this quarter. So I want to talk about two that were in the news. The first is the MOVEit breach, where a Russian ransomware game exposed a flaw in MOVEit protocol suite, and they stole a bunch of documents. That didn't affect us directly. We don't use that. But we did reach out to all of our suppliers to see if any of them used it, and we've been doing risk analysis around that if we get any affirmative results back from that. And then the other thing that the other board member brought up there with a fantastic beard is the cyber incident rule adoption. So this year the SEC adopted rules requiring public companies to disclose a material cybersecurity incident within 4 days. Material is kind of a weasel word. It can mean a lot of things. But we want to err on the side of caution, so we've updated all of our incident response plan with these disclosure requirements. We'll involve PR to help shape that earlier in the process. So we feel pretty good about where we're at. But that's definitely, when it comes to the stock price, that's something to be aware of, is that like when Clorox had their breach, they were one of the first ones that had to test these new rules, and it was a major hit on their stock price after that came out. So it's just something we need to be aware of. But we feel like being proactive and transparent about it is what will help minimize that breach. Like we had the opposite thing where Okta had a breach and they didn't talk about it for a long time, and then it just slammed their share price, and we want to avoid that. Any questions about these cyber events? Okay, great. That's it for our time. In the appendix, we did include some more details. So we have a slide about how we calculate the annual loss exposure if you want to dig into the math. We have this pretend slide that would have a big table with all the numbers about how we determined our risk quantification. We have the detailed results of our NIST assessment with this spider chart. So if you have any questions about those, feel free to review them later. Reach out to me. I'm happy to answer anything you've got. Thank you again for your time. And that's the end. So that's our board report, pretend board report. And it went a little longer than I thought because there's a lot more questions. Typically, I don't get that much interaction, so I was really happy that you guys had lots of questions. So keep pretending you're a director. What about that stood out to you? What did you appreciate, or what did you think, oh, I really didn't like that? Go ahead and shout out. Nothing. It was all
The brevity.
the brevity. Yeah.
You kept it quick. You let the questions drive any additional length of time it's going to be because you just introduced what's there, let them see it. There's not a lot of numbers, there's not a lot of detail, and you let the questions drive.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks. Yeah, the brevity is important, and we typically get 7 to 10 minutes, so we try and keep it brief.
So I believe you mentioned pre-reads.
Uh huh.
What do you typically send over in your pre-reads?
So this whole document is a pre-read, and then the appendix I always populate with anything that, like, if there's a new technical thing, that all goes in the pre-reads in the appendix in this. And some of them read it and really get into it, and some of them don't. So that's the great thing about the appendix is that for the people that appreciate it, they really appreciate it, and the people that don't, they can ignore it, and we don't waste their time in the meeting. What else?
Very prepared as far as being able to respond to their answers with data.
Yeah, it's super important to come really, really prepared. Like typically, when I'm preparing for one of these board presentations, I will put it all together, review it with our CIO, and then I practice it with my wife like 4 or 5 times. I practice it with other people. I get questions, as many as I can, and then add those to the appendix if they're too technical to explain. And I just say, hey, there's something in the appendix that talks about it, or that's the recent cyber event is great too, because a lot of times those questions get redirected to that. So yeah, it really works out.
Do you ever bring any like subject matter experts in case there needs to be a deep dive? Like say there is a security incident?
Yeah. I haven't really done that. We would like the way our organization is structured is we have all these portfolio companies and they all have their own independent IT departments. We just measure them. So if there was an incident, we might have someone from that was directly involved with it come and speak about it, but usually doesn't get that in the weeds. So typically we can talk about it and then we'll send out a postmortem afterwards. What else?
Are we confident that our insurers will help us in the event of something like a ransomware?
Yeah. I didn't talk about that much here. That's typically not something that I am directly involved with, so I don't talk about it too much. We have a risk department that manages that. But yeah, for some people, they're going to want to include a lot about it, and they're probably more directly in charge of it. Yeah.
You talked about moving and not affecting you, but do you ever go into kind of strategy like changes because of that type of exposure from adversaries?
Yeah, definitely. So and that's one of the things, like the directors will hear about all this stuff. Anything that makes the news, they hear about and they bring, and they want to know that we are aware of what's happening in the cyber world, that we know at least as much or more than they do about it, and that we're learning from other people's mistakes. That's the biggest thing. So anytime like Microsoft has an email breach, or Okta, right, we talked about that, or LastPass gets, every single one of those we want to talk about and be like, here's what we learned and what we changed in our environment to make sure that we don't either aren't directly affected to it or don't fall prey to the same type of attack, right? Do you guys think we answered our core questions? Should we keep the CEO? Should we change the pay structure? Are we managing risk? Are we operating with integrity? I see a, sort of.
I don't think we answered whether we're managing risk.
Yeah,
The reality is, you said we managed risk last quarter.
yeah,
You have no clue and didn't define what risk in the next quarter is.
yeah, that's true.
So we manage it, but I don't know that we're managing.
Yeah,
Yeah, I would normally include also kind of initiatives for the upcoming quarter as well.
yeah. I think you can go either way. We've done that, and when I started, mine were too heavy on those, where I would just be like, here's the roadmap of everything, and everyone's eyes just glazed over. And maybe I have swung too far in the other direction. Like I typically include it in the appendix, but I don't have like a roadmap. And it's not, I think that's a good idea to include, what the comment was to show that we're proactively managing risk, to include a roadmap of upcoming projects, to show what we're doing in the future, which I think is a great idea. Yeah.
Kind of skimmed over the recent cyber events and didn't really go into detail on how they impacted the organization.
Uh-huh.
Granted, those two examples may not have had this substantial impact. However, like the SEC mandate, what liability are we inheriting as an organization? You didn't address that. And what do we need to do to potentially avoid some liability there outside of just a stock price being hit?
Yeah.
And that does
Yeah.
maybe it does.
And it is possible that the board members would have dug into that. So typically, I include the recent cyber events last because that's where the vast majority of interaction comes from. So, and like this gentleman pointed out, oh, I think he might have, oh no, he's back there still. We want to let, if the board wants to extend the conversation, they can do that. I don't want to extend it and waste their time. So I try and front load it with all the data and stuff, and then we end with the cyber events because that's where we usually have the most conversation, and they can carry on the conversation and ask me as long as they want because it's their time. Once they're ready, they shut down the conversation and I head out, right? So.
Do you have them reach out to you after the fact sometimes?
Yeah, I've had some of them reach out to me after a fact, and I welcome that feedback. So I always say, hey, if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me. Yeah.
Do you ever have any asks to the board?
The only thing that I've read a couple times, we've done things like we need to create a document, a general response for if ransomware happens, would we pay the ransomware or not? Or would we respond in X, Y, or Z way, right? So stuff like that, like big strategic questions, we ask the board sometimes and get their opinion. I also, after a couple of them, I just asked the board for feedback. I said, I know that, you know, the goal of these is to provide you the information you need to make decisions. What would you prefer that I bring more of, and what would you prefer I bring less of? And that's where they were like, we want the dollar signs, man. How much is this gonna cost us? So we spent a lot of time on risk quantification because of that, which was really valuable feedback.
Do you prep the board on the PR aspect of maybe a ransomware breach?
Like we talked about it, yeah.
On, hey, don't just go to the news.
Yeah. They have, like, the communications department has this whole thing, and they do tabletops and stuff, so.
I know the board cares about security, right? All of them do, but who is the number one person that they actually hold responsible? Is it CISO? Is it the CEO? Because we're asking, should we keep the CEO?
Yeah,
And I guess the question is, in 7 minutes, we really can't perform a really great risk analysis, and there's no reality.
yeah.
Who do we hang your 7 minutes on, and your 7 minutes didn't give them enough?
Yeah. So really, that's a really good question. So the question is, what is the board supposed to do with this? Who is ultimately responsible if something does happen? And if they're dissatisfied with this 7 minutes, who do they hold responsible for it, for our brief time, right? So we talked about, like, the main power the board has is hiring or firing the CEO. So a lot of this presentation is just us showing them that the CEO is hiring the right people. And if they think the CEO is not hiring the right people, if they look at the job I'm doing and go, that was garbage, they're not going to come to me and say, I just want you to know you're bad and you're fired, because they can't. But they will go to the CEO and be like, hey, you did a bad job with this hire, and you should hire someone else, or maybe we should find a new CEO, right? This is a good question, yeah.
How many questions do you actually get from your board during this presentation?
It depends a lot, but usually way more questions than time. We almost always get cut off.
I wonder if that's the same across the room.
Yeah,
Are they actually interested?
Yeah, I don't know if we're abnormal, but we do an audit committee meeting as well that have 2 board members in that meeting that we go into much more depth on what's going on and a lot of this other stuff, so, and the chair of the audit committee, I think, kind of rolls up also in some responsibility on cyber as well.
yeah.
I've dealt with a range of, we'll call it, levels of sophistication in boards.
Yeah.
And some of the less sophisticated variety would probably give you the deer in the headlights look with some of that stuff. I mean, we're talking sort of that is, why do I have to do this multi-factor authentication thing? It's really annoying. Any thoughts or strategies for dealing with some of that?
I do. I have some thoughts. I'm going to go ahead to a slide and jump ahead a little bit and kind of show you what I'm talking about. So the question was, let's say that we have a less sophisticated board member, at least in the ways of cybersecurity, right? And they might be asking basic things like, why do you have to do MFA? How do we deal with that, right? So every board is different, and every individual on the board is different. What I've found is that it's better to start simple and then work your way to complexity and find the right balance for your board, right? So when I first started, I would have like, see the NIST CSF, this little, right, like this bar graph. For whatever assessment we were doing at the time, I'd have a page that's just the bar graph and nothing else, and these numbers, and that was way too little detail, right? So but it was really easy for me to say, oh, okay, they weren't satisfied with that, I need to add a little bit more, and then to keep adding until we find the right. I feel like it's harder to start with a bunch of stuff and then simplify it, right? So that's my thing is you need to target your audience, start simple and work your way. Yeah, let's go through these a little bit, and then we'll have some more time for questions at the end. But yeah, as the gentleman in the back pointed out, we want to keep to the allotted time unless the board prolongs the discussion themselves. So because the time is so short, it's best to keep to just a few subjects. You typically have a lot to talk about, so we do subjects on a rotating schedule. So every quarter we talk about something else. So maybe one quarter we're talking about HIPAA compliance or PCI or something like that, or some regulatory. And the next quarter we're talking about some internal controls. And the next quarter we're talking about external attacks or whatever, right? Whatever you're doing per quarter, it's useful to just, like, I have a slide in my regular board deck that says quarter one we report on this, quarter two this, quarter three this. I bring it up every single quarter so they know exactly what to expect and what we're going to talk about. And then they know when to expect us to like go more in depth and when it's like a shorter, quicker conversation. So it's good to hit more data throughout the year, but you got to keep that initial one pretty small. The other thing is introducing domain-specific knowledge. So a lot of times you'll be introducing something that's new to the board of directors, and it's hard to know how much time to spend instructing versus how much time to spend reporting. You want them to understand what you report, but you don't want it to turn into a class, right? So what I've found works best is if you just have really short instructions because you introduce new things really gradually. That's the first thing is you don't say, here, and I made this mistake where I was like, we're doing this thing, and it was like 6 slides long and everybody hated it. So instead, if we can do 1 or 2 slides to introduce a new concept, that's about the limit. We go through that so that they understand how that connects to the rest of the concepts we've already introduced and we're already doing. But even more important than that is that you don't want to drag them into the cyber world, you want to bring themselves into your world. So like, look at annual loss exposure, which is just a renaming of annual loss expectancy, which is a common risk management tool, right? That's something that a lot of board members are going to be familiar with because they have risk backgrounds or because they have financial backgrounds. So we're taking cyber data and presenting it in a way that they're really familiar with. And like this annual loss exposure, which you would think, oh, this is a complicated subject and we got complaints. Not a single complaint or question or anything about this. Everyone just got it right out of the gate, right? Because it's tied to something they already know about. So if you're going to introduce new stuff, it's better to go in their direction instead of trying to pull them in your direction. Okay, I thought there was a hand back there. We already talked about the almighty dashboard, but again, start simple, expand on it, and it's always good. So these key developments, right? It's good to have like the data and then the interpretation of the data right next to it so that they can look at it on their own and not need you there to interpret it for them, right? So that the slide makes sense even without someone there talking about it. We already talked a lot about the recent cyber events as a place in for discussion and demonstration. So it's just demonstrating that, yeah, we stay on top of things. We learn from other people's mistakes. We're actively trying to improve the org's cybersecurity posture. The one thing I want to highlight here is the difference between statistics versus anecdotal evidence. So this slide is statistics, and this slide is anecdotal evidence. And think about like the statistics about wearing a seatbelt. Everybody knows that wearing a seatbelt is important. Statistically, logically, they know it, right? But if you know someone who was ejected from their car during a crash because they weren't wearing their seatbelt, you are going to click that seatbelt every single time no matter what because you have anecdotal evidence. So as statistics are really strong, but anecdotal evidence is more visceral, right? It leaves more of an actual impact. So you need to have both statistical evidence as well as anecdotal evidence to really make an impact, to help them know that, yes, statistically you can see I'm doing my job. We are doing everything we can to improve cybersecurity. And anecdotally, yes, we are learning from everybody. We're doing everything we can. Yeah.
To what extent do you have to explain, like, this CSI?
So yeah, when we introduced that, we did say NIST is it's a government institute, CSS, cybersecurity framework, blah, 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 and we talked about it. So you definitely, like, that's one of those things where you would introduce it as a slide or two as you introduce that type of assessment. But what makes it a lot easier is leaning on standards, right? So directors really like stuff that is industry standard. So if you're saying we invented this, like annual loss exposure is kind of going more out there on a limb than I would prefer, because I'm saying here's this thing that we didn't invent but that we renamed and it's on. If you say this is a government tool that they use for critical infrastructure, then they understand it and they trust it, right? They don't need to know every single detail about it. I mean, basically all you need to say is government makes it for critical infrastructure, we're using it with slight modifications, and it's a 4-point scale, and we're at 3.5 or whatever, right? And then they're gonna get the biggest points out of it. Yeah, great question. Okay, the last slide is the appendix, right? And like we were talking about, that's where you can get as technical as you want. You can really go crazy and have charts and graphs and lines and formulas and whatever you want to do. This is where you really want to exemplify transparency. For the board of directors to know that you're operating with integrity, you should be as transparent as you possibly can be, like maximum transparency, right? So that's where you include the data behind the conclusions that you come to in the rest of the presentation. And then as you're reviewing it beforehand, if you go, okay, like in this CSF, if we were just introducing that and I realized it was gonna require some more technical explanation, I would think of a 30-second answer, and then I would have a couple slides that explain it, so I can say, here's what it is in 30 seconds. If you want more detail, in the appendix, there's a couple slides about it. And like someone pointed out, the more prepared you are, the more they will understand that you know your job. You're doing what you're supposed to be doing, right? And they can have confidence in you, and thus confidence in the CEO's hiring capabilities. Okay. Let's talk about some final things. I just had one to answer any last questions. But I want to highlight that you need to remember the directors' backgrounds and purpose, who they are, where they're coming from, what their world is, right? And if you can put themselves in their shoes, then as you create the board presentation, it'll speak to them a lot more, right? And they'll be able to make the decisions they need to make because you'll have a better idea of what information they need to have. So speak their language, don't, okay. And then the other one is keep the context of cybersecurity in mind. So I wanted to highlight that cybersecurity is kind of a subset of risk management, which is a subset of other things. Like it is a very small, we get 7 to 10 minutes out of a 2-day board meeting, right? Which is about right for us probably, because they don't need to know every single detail. Like they're not going to be making small decisions like weighing in on whether we should switch endpoint protection or if we're doing enough log correlation or whatever, or trimming or whatever, right? They just need to know that we know what we're doing and that we're doing our job. And then they have a whole bunch of other stuff to worry about. So just I know that to us, cybersecurity is incredibly important because it's we live with day in, day out, and we can't imagine other people not viewing how important it is. But to them, it's just a little part of their job. And we just need to keep that in mind and not try and push the importance of it. We're not going to convince them that it's the most important thing in the world because to them it isn't. Seek feedback to tailor your presentation to your audience. So seek feedback from people at work, from other people that you trust, as well as from the board of directors. If some of them are comfortable talking to you and providing feedback, it's really helpful to get that feedback. So again, because there's no right way to do a board, and this presentation that I gave here, I wouldn't want anyone to duplicate, because this is just the presentation that I got to after experimenting over several years, right? And finding what things they found useful and what things that they didn't find useful. And for every board, every organization, that's going to be different, right? And the last thing I want to talk about is empathizing. And we talked about that a little bit. We started, right, with this idea of method acting and putting yourself in the place of the board of directors. But the ability to empathize and view your presentation how the board of directors is going to view it, kind of non-judgmentally, is going to make it so much better. And I feel like that's just one of the key things that I've had to do is learn more about board of directors in order to know better what they need to hear from me. And again, that's the board of directors that I report to. I don't know about all board of directors, but the people that I report to, I've learned what I need to learn them. So, any other questions? Yeah.
What situations have you run into where you've had to present data to support the should we keep the CEO question, and what data was presented, and were you asked to present that data?
Okay. I feel like the only thing where we would be in that, so the question was, have we ever had to submit data directly supporting the should we keep the CEO question? And I think the only thing that would happen for me that's directly related to that is if there is some kind of event, right? Because a lot of the decision making in some kind of major breach is going to happen above my level. And we practice and plan out. And in that postmortem, we're going to talk about how did things go and how did we engage with the C-suite. That's the type of information that they probably care about most. But the rest of the information is just, are you doing your job? Did we hire the right person? Do we have confidence in you? That all supports or denies the should we keep the CEO. But I'm not trying to be like the boardroom kingmaker or anything like that. That's a good question.
Yeah, if you, it sounds like you took stock preparation, having what you need there, but when you run into those moments where you kind of blindsided, what's your kind of go-to management?
I just look at my phone and go, oh my gosh, we've been hacked. And I run out of the room and then it's great. And then I go, no, don't worry guys, we dealt with it. It was huge. There was all kinds of cryptos and, no, that's a good question. And the thing that like, my goal is to be honest and not to BS anybody, right? Because they'll detect that. They've been around for a while. So I just say, I don't know for sure. This is what we're doing. Let me look into it and get back to you. And that's happened a few times where I had questions where I had to say, let me look into it and get back to you. And typically I'm freaking out and I send them an email that afternoon after doing some research and I'm like, here's what I found. And then they're satisfied. So yeah, just saying like, I'm not sure, I'll look into it. If you're saying I'm not sure a lot, then there's probably something wrong with your preparation. But if you're saying it, a couple times in every board meeting, it's not a big deal. In my opinion, would you say differently? No?
I think it's good to be upfront and just say, hey, I'll get that information.
Yeah. Yeah.
In light of saying you're trying to save the board time, one thing that's always helped me is to actually put a takeaway on each slide. So it's reducing costs and reducing risk. Like, because some of them don't even want to pay attention to that one slide. So it's just like one line.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's great. So the comment was like on the slides, it'd be good to have like a headline, like this is the outcome. This is what we're doing. Reducing costs, reducing risk. I think that's a great idea. There was a hand back there. I guess, go ahead.
So you, on this, and this probably isn't real data, but your jump a full point and then another full point over 2 years. When you were cleared out at 1.75, would you explain like where your concerns are? And, the big one way to say this is where we really need to focus.
Yeah, so the question was, if you are in a place where you really need to improve, how much do you communicate what you're doing to improve? And I do think that's where, as you and the other gentleman were talking about, like having the roadmap and even forecasting the score, like a lot of the tools that you use to do these assessments will say, hey, if you resolve these findings, then that'll improve your score this much. So you can say, here's the 4 projects we're going, and we anticipate being at a 2.5 by this year, and then a 3.3 by this year, blah, 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 right? And then you got to hit those targets, but yeah, I think it's good. Don't go too in the weeds, but definitely just give them some confidence that you're heading in the right direction still. Any other questions? I think I'm about out of time, but. Okay, thank you guys a lot for, I cut off your applause. No. I want to applaud you guys. Thank you for participating and doing the stupid method acting game and pretending to be board members. I really enjoyed it, and I really appreciate all of your insights. If you want to reach out to me later on LinkedIn or whatever, I'd love to hear from you. But thank you guys so much.